Broadcasting from Great Gate Studios, it's time for Connected with Laurie. Tune in every other Wednesday to learn about the future innovation of technology and advanced tech trends. Here is your host, Laurie Caruso.
On this podcast, we focus on the future innovations of technology. In order to have technology in buildings, we need to know the correct way to install it. Riser management is critical. And we're going to learn all about why that's so critical on this episode of Connect with Laurie. I am your host, Laurie Caruso, and I have guests in the house, Montgomery Technologies here. I'm so excited to meet you both here. I cannot wait to hear all about riser management. Greg Jones, the president of Montgomery Technology, and Joe Gaspardone, the CEO from Montgomery Technologies. How are you guys? Welcome.
Thanks, Laurie, for having us.
Yeah, great, Laurie. We're doing well. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to explain riser management.
Riser management. Most people, I am assuming, don't even know what that means. And I'm curious too. I know I'm going to learn a lot here on this podcast. So I would love to hear all about it. Greg, why don't you get us kicked off? Talk to us. What is riser management and why is it so important?
Riser management really is the management of the telecom infrastructure within a commercial or mixed-use office building. So typically, it involves all of the common area spaces where the telecom providers bring their infrastructure into the building, and then from there, it usually goes vertically through the building. And really, it's the key for tenants to get connected to the internet, which we all know is super important for any business of any type in today's growing connected world.
Yeah, and it can be broken down kind of into three segments, Laurie, or three main segments. There's sort of access screening, ensuring that people who get in there have proper insurance and are only allowed into the areas that they need to work in. Another is enforcing building standards. So there's cabling issues, fire stopping, building codes, and ensuring that's being followed. And then the last part is sort of documentation, because without documentation and knowing what you have and where it is, you're really in a what amounts to a jumble of cables. So all of that is sort of liability protection for the building, and that's why people take it on.
Well, I just hearing this, I hear liability, I hear risk, I hear there's so many reasons why riser management is so important. And I know, when I go with installing DAS infrastructure, the first thing I'm not mentioning is riser management. And I know it's so important, especially after talking to you guys today. So I want to know, how did you guys get started in this? Like what kicked it off for you? Greg, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this wasn't a big deal. It didn't exist for a long time, and that's because the phone company owned everything. So all of the cable and all the copper that was installed in commercial office buildings across the country was installed and owned by the phone companies. Well, they deregulated telecom in the late 1990s, and all of a sudden this infrastructure became common, and the landlord suddenly assumed the responsibility for the riser system from the minimum point of entry up the building. This was then coupled with all of these new internet companies that came out providing connectivity. So all of a sudden we had a utility owned and operated by the phone company that was suddenly turned over to the landlord, and it really became the Wild West of everybody trying to get infrastructure installed, and suddenly the landlord had this risk, and riser management was started, and we started right around this time to help the landlord manage their risk.
And then now, Laurie, you've got also this sort of secondary wave where you have many providers and they all need to have their equipment in the building in order to serve the building. And so that's led to, an explosion in the number of cables that physically have to be run in the building, so that you've got that sort of coming in after deregulation.
So I know space is limited, especially in older buildings. And when, the architect might be designing these buildings, they might not think that they have to have so much space involved with this. And I'm curious, Joe, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the properties are looking for and what pain points they're faced with.
So you hit on one of the big ones. What's happened is it's not just the new providers coming in, but now we have the Internet of Things. We have all of these additional capabilities, and all of them require cabling. Even Wi-Fi, every single Wi-Fi, every WAP in the building has to be wired from the basement, from the MPO, to that device. So even when you're talking about wireless, you still have this explosion of wiring that's occurring. In addition, every new sensor, every piece of lighting control, that's all a new sort of paradigm when it comes to cabling and connectivity. And then every tenant is putting data out to the cloud. And so instead of having one internet connection, they sometimes have to have 2, 3, 4 redundant internet connections so that if one goes down, they have a way to keep things flowing. So it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the riser. And as you point out, many of them were not designed for this. So having somebody in there who understands it and is focused on it is really critical. And in the broader sense, the points of pain are actually surprisingly broad. There are everything from negotiating the license agreements with these new providers to incorporating lease terms to make sure that the riser is protected. There's a lot that we do underneath to kind of support, and all riser managers do by and large, to support the building and sort of offload the overhead and the to-do list. So we kind of think of it as you have 300 to-do lists that involve the riser. We take that off so that you can focus on the rest of the operation.
Super critical. I can see that. And, I know working on projects just in New York City alone. So it might be, 34 floors, and you might have 7 tenants in that building, occupying maybe 2, 3 floors. And that alone, I'm sure, is a challenge in itself, because everybody, like you said, is trying to plug in, and they're trying to get all their infrastructure in so they can operate. But when you have so many tenants in one single space, I can only imagine what that looks like. And I have seen some closets with wiring that, not so great. So I'm sure this is why this is so important. So Greg, what are some of the things that you guys offer from Montgomery Technologies and some of your competitors offer? What do you offer for the clients?
Well, I think that at the core, it's the single point of contact. So any question about telecommunications infrastructure or the riser space or anything like that goes to our system, so that we're keeping track of that. So rather than having a security guard who may be on the job for the first time make a decision about who can get into a critical area that could compromise the entire building, we offload that, and we have a vetting process where we have to manage that interaction, that access. And rather than have a contractor who may or may not be at the building or have a certificate of insurance on file with the building, we do all the work. So we've got the insurance piece covered. We've got the process in terms of how do you get into the building, how do you access the spaces, how do you notify the tenants on the floors that you're going to be there. All of those processes are managed via the riser manager, so you don't have a whole bunch of people involved with the simple act of getting a cable extended. And that really eliminates a lot of the challenge for the property staff, whether it's the engineers that in some cases have to walk the people around and show them around if they've never been there before, the property manager who has to make sure the insurance is on file, the security staff that has to oversee the keys. All of these factors come into play. So by putting it in the hands of a riser manager, that's all part of their contract. They do that for the building owner and for the property team and really make it so that it's simple and efficient. And that's really at the end of the day, that's really what we're trying to do, is maximize efficiency.
Super important to maximize that efficiency. Now, I understand commercial real estate. I can see that, especially, with these large buildings. What other buildings are you in? What other buildings do you actually focus on? Schools, hospitals, what else?
It's really interesting. Primarily, riser management has been limited to the commercial market. And for a long time, it was really even at the top end of the commercial market from a square footage standpoint. So you saw most buildings that had riser management would be maybe 200,000 square feet and higher. But interestingly, as the explosion of all of these connections, wiring, connectivity have occurred, that threshold has really dropped. We're seeing a lot of buildings that are quite literally 50,000, even 40, 30,000 square feet that have these needs because of the connectivity issues. And the same problem, the riser space is so tight or limited in design. So finding ways to get in there and make things work, value engineer it, that part of it we're seeing. But really, there's no reason. The industrial is a good example. There are some industrial buildings now that are moving to that for the same reasons. And one area that I really think someday will explode is probably the multifamily side, because even though the needs are more limited, these high-rise buildings still have a riser, and they still have these connectivity needs for the building itself. So I think that over the long run, that's probably where that's headed.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. So I'm going to use the example again in New York City. When you have several tenants fighting for space and they're trying to get online, how do you keep the tenants out of it? Because you probably want to work with the property owner itself and not the tenants, but the tenants want to have their in. They want to have say, right? Am I right on that?
Yeah, no, I think one of the fundamental things that we all recognize that the business of real estate is to rent space, and the rent payer is the key constituent. So we need that rent. So we have to help our tenants. And what we often find is that tenants want connectivity. They want things done efficiently. And even though they may have their own vendor, that vendor may have never been in that building. So by having a riser manager that knows the infrastructure and the building inside and out, that knows how to get things done in a building, is often more cost effective, let alone the administrative hassle of having to bring somebody new in, have them learn the ins and outs of the building, get their certificate of insurance on file, and all that. That's really where you see the riser manager. For a lot of tenants, we work with a lot of institutional tenants that they have their way that they want things done, but you have a quick conversation about the way the building is set up, the steps that have been taken to protect the infrastructure. Again, risk management is really critical here. And letting them know that the areas are secure, no one can get in there. It really puts their mind at ease and says, hey, these guys know the building, they know how to get stuff done, and I trust them. And as we do this across the country, more and more larger users are saying, hey, I love when there's a riser manager involved because it takes away all the headaches for me. I know that they'll get it done for me.
And that's such a key piece of it, Laurie, is the riser manager is really supportive of the tenants. It's really supportive of the building operations. And when you think about that in the broad sense, it's the tenants and the building staff itself. So we're really not on one side of the coin or the other than we're representing the building's interests. But part of the building's interest is supporting the tenants. So it's really more about providing the service to them and being able to show the value both to the tenants and the building. Otherwise, there's you're only on one side of the equation, but it's really both.
So important. And I also hear from a cost perspective, like you were saying, it's costly, if you're going to do it the wrong way. And that's why it's so critical we do it the right way. So we're going to get into that. I want to go and do a deep dive on how that cost looks if we're going to be doing it the right way. But before we do that, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Tenants complaining about their steep internet bill or no alternative for service? Additive provides the ultimate solution for your commercial or residential tenants who demand better connections. With bandwidth-hungry services increasing rapidly, Additive can deliver up to 10 gig speed through their cloud-managed technology. The in-building network solution creates a common IP backbone that allows property managers to both sell better performing internet service to tenants and securely connect the in-building infrastructure and smart building technologies to the internet. Are you ready to be the best internet service provider for your property? Contact additivims.com and make the change.
Hi, and welcome back to Connected with Laurie. I am here with Montgomery Technologies, and we're talking about the critical reasons why we need riser management. So before our break, we were talking a little bit about who's involved from a tenant perspective, from the property perspective. Let's get into also the structured cable contractors, other contractors out there. How do they look at riser management? And are they embracing this? Are they working with you on this?
I think that's a great question. I mean, one of the things about riser management is it is a specialty. So the tools and the expertise you need to be a riser manager in terms of fiber optic testing and understanding how circuits work is a bit of a different skill set than structured cabling. So you oftentimes, even if a structured cabling company does do some of this, it's a different group of guys, a different group of technicians that are doing the work. So I think what we find with a lot of our structured cabling companies is they say they can do everything, but they really aren't specialized in this part of the trade. So what we find in many cases is we have a clear delineation in a project where the structured cabling contractor takes care of everything in the space, and then the connectivity from the server room back to the riser closet and the riser in general is handled by the riser manager. So there's a clear demarcation between who's responsible for which part of the infrastructure. And when it's well documented and well versed in markets where riser management is common, it works really, really well. In other markets, will have scenarios where the structured cabling vendor says, I can do everything. And they may or may not be approved by the service provider. They may not understand the infrastructure of the building. They may not be familiar with the codes and the rules at that building. So that's where riser manager and the structured cabling contractors have a little bit of a little dance sometimes. But in most cases, it's handled professionally and people sort of know the drill. And if the property manager, the general contractor is aware of the rules of the road, it can go very smoothly.
And that's that third leg of the stool, in essence, Laurie. That you've got, you've got the internet service providers, you've got the tenants. It's really four legs, I guess. You've got the building staff, but you have the low voltage contractors. And so, if you think of that, really Montgomery or any riser management sits right in the middle of all that, really to support all of it. And that's what we find is especially when contractors are familiar with riser management, they really love it because it helps facilitate what they're really trying to do, which is the suite cabling in the suite itself, the TIs. And so that's again another aspect of that, facilitating the building operation. It has to work for them as well.
You touched a little bit about it as far as the integration, so to speak. And I know that everybody wants to capture their asset in this closet, in the riser management side. They're saying, this is my side, this is my space, stay away. I don't want you touching it because if you cut my cable, I'm going to have a problem. And then we've got issues. So tell me, how does that integrate with the existing building currently? So if you're going into a new or an existing building that's already operational, how do you go in there and change it up, so to speak?
Great. That's really one of my favorite questions, because people, if you haven't experienced it, then it really is, well, where do we start? How does it work? And there's a whole process. We call it an onboarding process, but that onboarding process of a building is all about investigation and assessment of what exists, and then documenting that. Pictures, even video clips, a lot of assessment and sort of documentation up front, and then having that in a structured, centralized way within our platform to make sure that anything new, anything that changes, leveraging the power of the knowledge so that when somebody comes in and wants to do something, you know where every cable is, where it runs, where it's terminated. All of those things are kind of the center point of onboarding a building. And once you've established that baseline of what exists, then it's just an incremental process to take on each new change or each new addition and document that and have it in a central repository. So that really truly is what you get to leverage once you've come through the sort of onboarding process. That's what it's all about. And a lot of those buildings start with a mess of cables. I mean, a big mess of cables, and there's a lot of work up front to figure that out. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, one part of that too is, when a tenant takes a lease and they move out, by many leases they're supposed to remove their cabling.
Right.
Well, if you don't know what they installed and you have no documentation of what was installed, then how are you going to force them to remove it? And who's going to remove it? And where's the risk if they remove the wrong thing? So that's really where it becomes part of a process, and that's where the riser management expertise is super critical, because as you mentioned at the beginning on this design, there's no one's designing buildings with more riser space and giving up leasable space for more infrastructure. They're actually doing the opposite and giving us less and less space to work with. So we have to be more and more efficient with how we utilize that space.
Here's the deal. I have seen so many projects stall out because we're trying to figure out who has the fiber map, who has the cabling map, who has what. I can't even get floor plans half the time. So who's going to manage that if I can't find, the existing history on where that cable goes and what happens? So I can only imagine the nightmares you might come into. But the fact that that's the important piece, because if anything happens in that building, now you've got it. Is that right?
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's your point is on the mapping is no one really does that unless they're forced to, and that's where riser management. That's part of the job is you have to keep track of all this infrastructure so that you know where things are located. And the alternative is people just run new cabling. Well, again, we've got a limited amount of space. We don't have infinite amount of riser space. Back in the old days when it was only one provider, it was okay. But now that we have 6 or 7 or 8 fiber providers in a building, we've got a finite amount of space and we've got to manage it correctly.
And that human analogy of the spine is just so true and so appropriate, because really those cables really represent the nerves running up through the spine. And if you were going to do surgery on the spine, you would really want to know where everyone is, because anything that goes sideways or is cut is going to affect something somewhere. So as that number exponentially increases, which is what's happening right now, it just becomes more and more important to really understand it, because there's so much sensitivity there now.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely a great analogy when you look at it that way, how that building has a heartbeat and it has a spine and it's alive. So you got to take good care of it. So Joe, talk to me a little bit more on how property owners get in touch with you. What happens? What's the process when they say, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I need? What's the next step?
It usually starts with a phone call or an email, and then it goes into our sales department, and there's usually a presentation involved explaining in more in depth what is involved in riser management and the management of that riser. Then there's usually some kind of proposal or some kind of outline of terms and a contract that spells that out. It's actually usually the building's contract, but an addendum that spells out the scope of services and all that's available and what we can provide. And then it really moves from that. That's usually kind of the easy part. The hard part is that onboarding process we described, where we really spend some time on our dime to get to know the building. And it usually involves contractors who know the building and documenting that what's there. That's a very involved process. And it also involves things like communications license agreements. And that's a part where we always like to bring that up, because it provides value, where you analyze who's in the building, and more importantly, who can we help bring, which internet providers can we bring into that building and pay rent to be in that building. So we like to try to show in the first 12 months like some real value in terms of bringing new revenue into the building on these long-term contracts to operate and run internet service. So we don't get paid as part of that, but it's really just a value proposition to say, hey, look, we know this business, we know what the market is and who pays rent and how much, and we want to help support that building. So that's another aspect of the service, is sort of managing what hasn't been managed before. That's sort of how we come. There are a lot of little things like that that are part of that onboarding.
Okay, I just heard it. Can make some money here too.
Yeah, well, again, we're not selling it, but it is just part of the service.
Part of the service, but here we are, a property owner with a pandemic that cannot get tenants to the space as a result of that. They don't know their next steps on what they're going to do and how long it's going to take to get tenants back to the space. So when I hear that you're solving pain points, I also hear that there's a cost savings potentially also involved with this, and maybe even a revenue stream. So let's review again, because I know we've discussed a lot. Maybe Greg, you can kick it off. Let's review all of the pain points that you solve with this.
Yeah, Laurie, I mean, I think the big pain point is from a property staff is who understands the technology, the changes, all of the new technology that's going to impact your building, whether it's the Internet of Things, it's DAS, it's mobility, it's multiple telecom providers. We're a single point of contact that can help with all of these technology questions. The riser management gives the property staff a reliable resource, a go-to, that they can get advice on anything technology related. And as technology continues to advance, and we're in COVID where people are working from home, access to the internet is more important than ever. We need a strategy and we need a partner that can help us get there and help us continue to evolve with the ever-changing needs of our tenants. And that's really what it's all about. We've got to keep tenants in these buildings. We have to keep up the occupancy. We have to make sure that the building is having a good return on its investment. And at the end of the day, we're really about helping the building owner make money at this, and that's keeping the spaces leased and generating as much revenue as we can.
And Laurie, you've probably had some experience with this, but it's so difficult to find a neutral party that isn't selling a solution, but just a neutral party that you can go to for advice about implementation. Touchless tech is a big thing right now, and there are just thousands new solutions that are out there. But finding somebody that has the context for which solutions have worked, do work in various buildings across the country, and finding somebody who's not selling a solution but has the knowledge to give you advice and in a consultative way is really hard to find. And so we've always felt like that may be one of our biggest value points is we see it all. We see it all implemented. We don't sell any of it, but we know what works and what's worked over time and where it works and the ins and outs of almost every solution that's out there. So a lot of times the buildings, the smart ones, will come to us and leverage that knowledge base to get some actual neutral advice as to what they should do.
Important. And I know, obviously, with our technology and how quickly it's evolving, carriers, property owners want 5G, they want to have small cell, they want rooftop access, they want it all. Especially now, we are moving at the speed of light. I always say that on my podcast, the technology is moving in the speed of light. What's our next? What's our future? What do we have here? And why is it so important to have riser managed because of future technology? Maybe Greg, you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Everyone says it's moving at the speed of light. Have you been in a commercial office building where we have the same infrastructure that we've had since the building was built and it's still there? That's sort of the challenge in the commercial office space is that we're not moving quite as quickly as we could be. And part of it is fear and part of it is the economics. And I think really what we need to continue to do is embrace technology because tenants need it. The tenants are demanding that they have access to they want to be able to control the BMS. They want to be able to change the lighting profile. They want to be able to have the air monitored so they know that they're putting people in an environment where the air is safe. So the tenants want this, and the landlords have to come up with a program to help embrace technology. And the big one that you're working on, Laurie, and everyone's trying to figure out is connectivity and 5G. Well, that requires a whole bunch of new infrastructure installed in the building, and it's all going to go up the riser system. And how are we going to manage that next wave of connectivity? Because wireless is always wired somewhere. So I think, as technology continues to evolve, coming up with a plan or strategy and looking at it holistically is going to be critical for building owners as we embrace the technology demands that are going to be forced upon us by our tenants.
And the other side of that coin is security. That's become a bigger and bigger thing, and something that we've been involved with is how do you secure the explosion? Every new device needs some kind of connection to a network and to the internet. How do you manage that, consolidate it so it's in a manageable way, get the traffic going where it needs to go, and do it all in a cyber secure way? And that's sort of the new aspect of what we've done over maybe the last 10 years. But and to answer your question, that's where it's going. Where it's going is something has to happen to keep that infrastructure in a manageable and functional for the building operations as well as for the tenants. It's a sort of a burgeoning new piece of what we see going up and down the riser.
The importance of riser management. You've heard it here, folks. That's it. Thank you so much, Greg, Joe, Montgomery Technologies. We really appreciate enlightening me. I learned a lot today, I have to say.
Thanks,
so
Laurie.
thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Take care.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Interested in being part of our show or advertising on our podcast? Contact us at info@fifthgenmedia.com for more information. We'd love to be a part of your success.